Thank you for having me. Thanks, Marina and Alice, for putting this together. It's always wonderful to be here. I think, like Zenu pointed out earlier, many of us have been coming to this conference for a long time. It's been close to 15 years for me, and I was a student for most of that time before actually joining Gore. So Zenu and I actually worked together for a few years. Now I work at a startup called Revon Systems. So I'm going to tell you about a very different problem than some of the classic porous media problems that certainly I used to work on with Zenu at Gore. Let me just start by saying that hopefully I'll get through this and leave plenty of time for questions. I just want to introduce you to our company a little bit, and then tell you about essentially our differentiating technology, which are called smart symptom trackers, and the problem that technology is meant to solve. And then I'll specifically go into pulmonary illnesses briefly, because our technology right now, at least what's out in the marketplace and what's being heavily tested, specifically relates to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is COPD, and asthma. I'll talk a little bit about our development process so far, and so the kind of modeling methods that we currently use, and some of the results, so how those algorithms have performed, those models have performed, and then we'll go into the workshop goals. So briefly, Revon is a small startup. It's a Kentucky-based startup, though we're building our presence in New York City right now. The team of founders for our company are actually a group of serial entrepreneurs. They actually have 4 other companies that they ran before they found ours. Their most recent company just went public. It's called Apellis. They're mostly pharmaceutical experts, so they develop drugs. Revon is a company that is trying to attack therapeutic healthcare from a technology sort of point of view rather than from a chemical or biopharmaceutical point of view. And really the problem we're trying to solve is at-home care, at-home decision support, at-home detection of disease flare-ups. So how do you give patients a way of understanding what's going on with their illness when they're not at the doctor's office? How do you find flare-ups early? How do you tell them what to do about it? And then how do you build a technology that ultimately, when pitched into that patient population, results in improved health outcomes, things that you can measure? Okay. Now, the key sort of pain point that we say we sort of address among patients is really this sort of anxiousness, uncertainty, lack of understanding of what they really need to do. Okay, when they're at home and they don't have access to somebody who can sort of guide them to the right place. Okay, and the truth of this is that anxiety, that uncertainty, that often false decision at home is a monstrous healthcare expenditure among a huge set of chronic illnesses. The $20 billion that's pointed out on that slide for COPD is really just the icing on the cake in this problem. For COPD, you're talking about 9,000 maybe a night, American dollars, when a person has an exacerbation of their illness and they're admitted into a hospital. Even if they're not admitted, there's huge costs associated with going to the emergency room or going to the hospital and then getting discharged. A lot of times, if you had just sort of caught the initial part of their symptom escalation early, they could just take their inhaled corticosteroids in the case of asthma, or the controller medications, and maybe even catch an infection early with some antibiotics, and they would be just fine. So maybe start their prednisone if they're sort of sensing the exacerbation of their illness. And these are cheap ways to deal with it. And it also improves the long-term function of the patient. So it's been shown in quite a set of literature that the more exacerbations, what we call clinically significant exacerbations, that these patients have, the larger the reduction is in their overall lifespan, the more destruction there is to their actual bodily function. And so even if they're living for a while longer, their parts aren't working as well, so to speak. So their lungs aren't operating the way they're supposed to for the case of pulmonary patients, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the depressing thing is, to a certain extent, is that this is essentially the solution for at-home care at the moment. Doctors give these patients these paper checklists that say, if you have 2 symptoms in category 1 and 1 symptom in category 2, you should call a doctor, And, I will go out on the limb and say that this is just categorical nonsense. And I can't imagine why this would work on anybody, but of course, it's sort of better than nothing, right? Because patients are complicated. The physiological basis of their symptom flare-up is not always detectable. It's certainly not known in a lot of clinical literature. And so, the fact that somebody is having trouble sleeping, for example, they could just have a pillow in the wrong place. It doesn't mean that they're having a vicious lung attack. This is actually a card for heart failure action plans. This is not a pulmonary illness, and you'll see something that's very common here. Weight gain of more than 5 pounds in a week is an indication that you should go to the emergency room. And the reason for that, right, is because one of the primary symptoms of congestive heart failure is fluid accumulation, either in your legs, which they call lower edema, or in your stomach. And that is basically a capillary leak that comes because your heart actually is too weak to sort of function properly. And I won't get into more detail on that specific subject than that. But you can imagine that weight gains, on a daily basis or even a weekly basis could be the result of anything. I'm probably 2 pounds heavier than when I woke up this morning. Okay? And so these plans, they're just not an adequate solution to the problem. People are complicated. Now, live-in nurses are a reasonable solution. They're just heinously expensive, and most people can't afford that. And then, a lot of telemonitoring and management apps that are out right now, some mobile applications, they're trying to address this problem too, but they're essentially just putting action plans like this into an application. Okay, so the strategy that we thought we could do is actually come at this and try to make some modeling predictions, okay, based on this sort of huge diverse set of clinical indicators of exacerbations. Okay, and there are a huge set. There's a variety of symptoms, patients, and those symptoms for somebody who's a certain age, a certain gender, has certain other comorbid conditions, because comorbid conditions are just other illnesses that they have. Those symptoms can mean something different for all those patients. And so you have a lot of different types of patients, you have lots of different types of symptoms, and you have lots of different types of vital signs, things like O2 saturation, your temperature if you're having an infection, that might indicate a different type of problem. Okay, so this is an example of one version of our application, Revon's application that is out right now, and this was sort of meant for COPD patients. Really, what our application does is, patients interact with this on a daily or weekly basis. They enter in their health data, whether it be their O2 saturation or their symptoms for the day, their age, their gender, their height, their weight. And as they're updating this app, sort of their baseline condition is better understood. And if they're concerned about their health, they can sort of press this Am I OK button and put in a set of symptoms that have been carefully chosen from the literature as well as from quantitative analysis of data sets that I'll talk about later. And then they answer those questions, and what happens is they get a recommendation from a machine-learned algorithm, okay, a supervised set of algorithms that try to say, all right, here's the likelihood that you're having a clinically significant exacerbation. You should call the doctor. You should go to the emergency room. And sort of here is an assessment of how severe your basic health profile is, how severe your symptoms are, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Does patient data involve any measurements, or is it purely subjective things that patients input?
Yeah, so the measurements, there are a variety of measurements for the different illnesses. So for COPD, in all of our clinical testing and probably in our long-term market strategy, they'll have what are called pulse oximeters, which will give you your heart rate and your basically the percentage of dissolved oxygen in your blood. It's called your oxygen saturation. And then a thermometer for temperature, infection. Thermometers are actually a fairly unambiguous way of detecting infections, so they're pretty good. And then for asthmatics, there's also measures of lung function, peak flow meters, and actually for COPD patients, what they called FEV1 is measured by spirometers. These are all things that they can enter into the app. Spirometers record how much air you can push into a column, well, what's called FEV1, how much air you can push into a column in 1 second. FEVC is how much air you can push into your lungs before you're out of air. And in a physical, you've probably had one of these tests before, right? They put this thing in your mouth. They say to breathe and blow out as much as you can until you can't sort of blow out air anymore. These are the common measures of lung function among patients. Okay, so there are subjective and objective measures in there. This is just sort of a snapshot of our product portfolio as it is now, and sort of shows, we're furthest along in those pulmonary illnesses. We're working on congestive heart failure now, and then there's a variety of chronic illnesses, cerebral conditions, as well as chronic pain is a big thing right now. It's causing a major opioid crisis that the government is spending a lot of money on to try to fix. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you sort of look at this text down here, there really is a fairly sophisticated product strategy, that we have. We don't just build algorithms, of course. We have to prototype technology. We have to pitch that into patient populations and see if they use it. When they do use it, if they're getting any kind of objective health outcome. So, I actually spend a lot of time designing and executing clinical trials, and of course, speaking to potential clients, when I'm not doing mathematics. And this is a classic sort of depiction of a lean startup. Mostly this is here just to sort of say that we are a very technology-focused company, and we believe in doing things right. So we publish all of our work. We've put it through a heavy amount of scientific scrutiny. And this part, in development, which is so crucial on the top right, which is about rapidly taking feedback from the marketplace, iterating or prototyping a new product, pitching that into some kind of empirical testing, putting that back in the marketplace, and sort of you keep going around this cycle. It allows you to make evidence-based decision as opposed to, non-evidence-based decision, which is very common in technology development. Okay, so this slide here is really just meant to say that data science is of utmost importance to us. We use it to study our customer data. We use it to study physician-based data that goes and train on our algorithms. We use it to make prediction models, and it's central to all of our products. Okay. So quickly on pulmonary illnesses, I don't know how much you guys know about COPD. It's a brutal and pretty disgusting illness. It's actually the third leading killer of people in the country. It probably ought to be called number 2. Number 2 is cancer, but cancer includes every cancer bucket. And so as an individual illness, it kills more people than any individual cancer that I'm aware of. And then heart disease is way at the top. These figures here, and you'll see this for asthma on the next slide, 32 billion annual spending on COPD, that's supposed to go up to about 50 by 2020.
Have you asked these, or you thought about asking these clinicians to give a score, right? So, I guess where I'm going with this is how much are they leaning towards avoiding false positives or false negatives in the same way that you were mentioning?
So a score on that specific question?
Like these doctors might all assign a score of 5 or something, right? But depending on how tolerant they are of false positives or false negatives, they might give different recommendations.
Yeah, and so what would the score mean? Like score what?
We could compensate.
Yeah.
Like 0 to 10 of severity.
Yeah, we have some data on that. Yeah.
So I wasn't in the group, but I thought last year the MPI group did work on some kind of dynamical model or sort of first principles model on this or a similar problem. Is that, so what's the status of sort of these kinds of modeling approaches as far as development?
Yeah, so actually, the dynamical model, we didn't have enough data last year where they could do an out-of-sample prediction, so the model wasn't actually very strong for the future, for the temporal prediction. But actually, we have more data on that subject now, and I would love to take a look at that problem. I didn't write it up here. So predicting a future flare-up is a very interesting problem. Given a certain patient's past history, can you predict if they're going to have an exacerbation in 3 weeks? Yeah, we can get some data on that, absolutely. Yeah.
And the doctor's evaluation suggestion is different. But I think it also depends on this particular patient's health condition or anxiety, because then we say, okay, if we really in this situation, just go to the emergency room, because we are going to do, suppose we could do clustering data, or whatever the, even you go to neural network, you want to get the features very clearly, what you are going to put into it. But the question is here, you say, it wasn't clear to me, you say, this is the same situation, but the doctor's diagnostic or suggestion are different. I don't think 5 doctors look at one patient. It's, each doctor has its own patient, but it's just the symptoms the same. It's
No.
not the same patient.
It's the same patient.
Oh, same patient that 5 doctors look at?
Yeah, 10 doctors, in fact, yeah, same exact patient. So gender, age, height, weight, baseline disease severity, exact same patients.
Same time?
Same time.
Thank you.
And all doctors graduated from the same school. Well, this is like kind of like being conservative, more conservative or less conservative. Actually depends from where did you get your medical education.
Yeah, so, and that's a great question, and just I can briefly answer that. There's a mix of ethnicities and genders among them. The least experienced pulmonologist there is a chief resident. The most experienced been practicing for 20 years. And actually, there's no correlation that suggests that the most experienced doctors match the consensus more often. Although I will say that the best scoring physician was the most experienced, so to speak. So he'd been practicing for, I think, 25 years. Rich?
Did you find that the doctor's opinion data was better for asthma than it was for COPD? Is the variability comparable?
The variability is similar, but so there's much more consensus around emergency attention for asthma. So, you know, because actually they don't think most of these patients need to go to the emergency room. So there's a lot of disagreement in those 2 middle triage categories, variability there, but they perform much better on the extremes.
I still, so that, because your data has such a big variance in decision, so that means you need lots of data to get like a good analysis of that.
Yeah.
But you say in 10 doctors see one patient, that's like an experiment, not a real world. Real world situation is one doctor has his own patients, they're different. I don't see how much data you have really get some results with such a big variance will make sense.
Yeah, so if you look at the distribution of the consensus, you'll see that for about 50 to 60% of those 100 cases, the majority was very strong. So it was like 8 out of the 10 doctors all agreed on the same position. Now that other 40%, it's quite variable. And I think the problem there, and that's where sort of this practice bias comes in. People who are a little bit more risk averse or more, you know, I mean, so that's in there. Now, with regard to the real patient consideration, okay, actually, the data that they're getting here is much more objective and much more comprehensive than they would see in a real patient scenario. And so a lot of doctors have actually said, you know, if I saw this patient in real life, I'd probably think differently. But, you know, if you ask them, well, what would you want to know? They'll say, well, you know, I don't know. I mean, maybe the patient's having a divorce or they just have some anxiety attack. Try putting that in a data set and see if that'll increase, you know, the agreement on these cases. I mean, the truth is that these guys are practicing, and they'll agree actually to a large extent. This is a bit of an art form. There aren't objective metrics for what they should be doing, and so they're making a decision based on their instincts and what they've seen in practice. Some people live in areas and they treat patients who are in the emergency room all the time. Some people don't. But if you know, I'll give you my opinion on this because I don't have the data, but I can tell you, I would bet it would be much more variable if all of them saw the same patient in person than if they at least saw a set of 30 or 40 variables that are at least objective that are written on this sheet.